You have never seen reality, not once, not for a single second of your life. What you call the world is a guess, a reconstruction, a story your brain tells you so convincingly that you forgot it was ever a story. Right now, you're having an experience of reality that no human being who has ever lived has had, or ever will have again. Not because your circumstances are unique, though they are, but because the machine generating your experience of the world was built from a specific, unrepeatable sequence of accidents. The language your mouth first learned to shape, the face that first taught you what safety looked like, the punishment that first taught you what shame felt like, the century you happened to be born into, the algorithm that happens to be feeding you information right now. And yet it doesn't feel unrepeatable. It feels like reality, the one obvious, shared world everyone else is presumably seeing too. Ask 100 people what's real and true, and you'll get 100 different answers, delivered with the same absolute certainty. Ask them if they might be wrong, and most will say no. Not because they examined the alternatives, because they never knew there were alternatives to examine. This isn't a video about motivation. It isn't a 5-step plan to reinvent yourself by Monday. It's quieter than that, and considerably more disturbing. Why do intelligent, curious, capable human beings, people exactly like you, live and die inside a version of reality they never chose, never questioned, and never even realized was a version at all? Stay with this, because by the end, you may not be able to look at your own life the same way again. 2. What is reality actually? Here's an uncomfortable fact. Backed by more than a century of neuroscience, you have never once experienced reality directly. What you call seeing the room around you is a reconstruction, an internal simulation your brain builds from partial, noisy, often contradictory signals. Light doesn't carry color. Photons have no color at all. Color is manufactured entirely inside your skull. Sound doesn't exist outside a nervous system capable of interpreting vibration as sound. The world you experience is not the world. It's your brain's best guess about the world, optimized not for truth, but for survival. Immanuel Kant made this argument over 2 centuries ago. He split existence into the noumenon, the thing as it actually is, and the phenomenon, the thing as it appears to a mind. No human being has ever touched the noumenon. We only ever get the phenomenon. Reality, filtered. Modern neuroscience only sharpened his point. Your brain isn't a camera. It's a prediction engine. It takes a small trickle of sensory data and fills in the rest with expectation, memory, and assumption, so smoothly you rarely notice the seams. Optical illusions aren't glitches. They're the rare moment the seams show, and if perception is a construction, memory is even less reliable. Elizabeth Loftus spent decades proving human memory isn't a recording. It's a reconstruction, performed fresh every time you recall it, and every retelling can quietly rewrite the original. In her research, she and her colleagues implanted entirely false childhood memories into study participants. Memories those people later described in vivid, confident, emotional detail. The events never happened, which means the story you tell about your own life, the formative moments, the turning points, the person who wronged you, the person who saved you, has probably been edited more times than you know, by a narrator who never labels its revisions. For a moment, imagine that everything you remember about who you are has been quietly rewritten, again and again, by a version of you that no longer exists. Here's the part that should really unsettle you. Perception isn't just constructed. It's constructed differently depending on what your mind was already trained to expect. In a famous study, researchers asked people to watch a video of players passing a basketball and count the passes. A person in a gorilla suit walked directly through the frame, stopped, thumped its chest, and walked off. Roughly half the viewers never saw it. Not because their eyes failed, because attention, not the eye, decides what becomes real to your conscious experience. Whatever you're not looking for, you very often don't see. even when it's standing directly in front of you for 9 full seconds. Now identity to the pile. The you who was 5 years old, and the you reading this sentence. That continuity isn't a fixed object. It's an ongoing narrative your brain tells itself to feel coherent. There is no single location in your brain where you live, no control room, no one sitting at the panel, just a distributed process, generating moment to moment the sensation of being someone. So, perception is constructed, memory is reconstructed, and frequently wrong. Identity is a story, not a structure. If all 3 pillars of my reality are this unstable, the question isn't whether your reality is filtered up. The question is who or what is doing the filtering, and why they built it the way they did. That's where this really starts. Not in the brain, in the crib. 3. The first persona human being enters the world with beliefs. A newborn has no religion, no politics, no nationality, no idea what's normal to eat, wear, fear, or worship. For the first several years of life, a child is completely undefended, a mind with the door wide open, absorbing everything, questioning nothing. Because the capacity to question hasn't been built yet. That's not a flaw. That's the design. Human children are born radically unfinished compared to almost every other species on Earth. Precisely so culture can finish the job. A foal stands within the hour. A human infant can't even hold up its own head. That helplessness is the price of a brain flexible enough to absorb an entire civilization's worth of language, custom, and belief before it turns 6, which means every child inherits a reality before they're equipped to evaluate one. Language arrives first, and it's not neutral. The words available to a child quietly define the boundaries of what that child can think. Linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf argued that the structure of a language shapes the structure of thought itself, that a person raised with certain grammatical categories will, without noticing, perceive time, causality, even color, differently from someone raised with different ones. You can't easily think a thought your language has no word for. Part of the prison is built out of vocabulary. Then comes family, the first, most intimate curriculum. A child doesn't choose to inherit its parents' fears, but it inherits them anyway. If a parent flinches at conflict, the child learns, cell by cell, that conflict is dangerous, long before a single word gets exchanged on the subject. If a parent equates love with control, the child's internal definition of love absorbs that same equation and keeps using it in friendships, in marriage, in raising their own kids, until something forces them to examine it. Then culture, layered on like sediment. What's polite, shameful, ambitious, lazy, masculine, feminine, sacred, disgusting. None of that is a self-evident truth about the universe. It's a local agreement, sometimes a complete reversal from one civilization to the next. And every culture experiences its own agreements as simply how things are. Religion, where present, arrives with even more authority, often before a child can read, delivered by the very people that child depends on for survival, which means its claims land not as one hypothesis among many, but as bedrock fact, indistinguishable at that age from the fact that fire burns. Education arrives next, promising to teach a child how to think, while just as often teaching them what to think, which historical events matter, whose perspective gets centered, which questions are okay to ask out loud. By the time a child is old enough to reason critically, psychologists place the earliest capacity for abstract thinking around adolescence. The architecture of belief is already mostly built. Critical thinking doesn't arrive on an empty lot. It arrives inside a building that's already been furnished, wallpapered, and lived in for a decade. This is the first prison. It has no guards, because it needs none. Most of the time it was built out of love, by parents who wanted their kids safe, cultures that wanted their members cohesive, institutions that wanted functional populations. But a cage built out of love is still a cage. And the tragedy isn't that it got built, Every human mind needs some structure to function at all. The tragedy is that almost nobody is ever told it was built. They're just told, this is reality. Welcome to it. 4. The architecture of society. Childhood builds the first walls. Society spends the rest of your life maintaining them, quietly, continuously, almost invisibly. Because a wall that's never questioned never needs defending. Think about the modern information environment. You can, in theory, access more recorded knowledge in a single afternoon than an entire medieval kingdom held in its libraries. And yet, sit with this, greater access to information hasn't produced a more open-minded population. Because access was never the bottleneck. Attention was. Modern platforms aren't built to inform you. By their own engineers' admission, they're built to hold your attention as long as possible, because attention is the raw material their business converts into revenue. And the most reliable way to hold attention in every era of media isn't truth. It's emotional intensity, outrage, fear, tribal validation, novelty. That produces a strange, mostly unintentional effect. Your sense of what's happening in the world gets shaped less by what's actually happening, and more by what's most emotionally activating to show you. Two people can look at the same platform on the same day and get shown two almost entirely different realities, each one curated invisibly to keep that particular nervous system engaged. This isn't just a theory about media bias. It's close to a structural feature of how recommendation systems work. An algorithm built to maximize watch time has no built-in preference for accuracy, nuance, or balance. It only prefers authority compounds conformity in ways that are, frankly, hard to accept about our own species. In the early 1960s, Stanley Milgram recruited ordinary volunteers and had them administer what they believed were increasingly severe electric shocks to another person, on the instruction of a authority figure in a lab coat. A striking majority kept going well past the point of hearing what sounded like serious distress from the other room, not because they were cruel, because a person in a position of legitimate seeming authority told them to continue, and that pull proved stronger for most of them than their own conscience. Milgram's conclusion wasn't that his participants were unusual monsters. It was that ordinary people, under the right conditions, will very often outsource their own judgment to whoever is standing closest to the appearance of authority. Underneath all of it sits the ego, not arrogance, but in the psychological sense, the structure of self that has to be defended for you to feel like a coherent someone. Carl Jung argued the ego isn't the totality of your psyche. It's just its conscious surface, smaller and more fragile than most people assume, easily threatened, endlessly defended, which is why new information almost never gets received as simply information. It gets received as a potential threat to the self. And the self, like any organism under threat, defends first and evaluates truth second, if at all. The room has never changed. Only your perception has. Fear of uncertainty closes the loop. Across culture and history, humans show a strong, measurable preference for a known negative over an unknown possibility. Comfort zones aren't physical spaces. They're predictive zones, environments, and routines where your brain's model of what happens next reliably matches what actually happens next. Stepping outside them isn't just uncomfortable. It's genuinely destabilizing to your nervous system, because it introduces the one thing the predictive brain is built to eliminate. Surprise. Put it all together: confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, habit, conformity, ego, fear of uncertainty, and you no longer need an external jailer at all. Your mind has learned to guard its own cell. 6. History's prisoners. It's tempting to believe earlier eras were simply less intelligent, more superstitious, more easily fooled, and that we've finally arrived at clear sight. History disagrees, repeatedly and without much sympathy, for roughly 14 centuries. Nearly every educated mind in the Western world accepted, as an observable, common-sense fact, that the Earth sat motionless at the center of the universe, while the sun, and stars revolved around it. Not a fringe superstition taught by scholars, defended by philosophers, enforced by institutions with genuine confidence in their own correctness. When Galileo presented evidence to the contrary in the 17th century, he wasn't just disagreed with, he was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life, because the geocentric model wasn't experienced as one theory among several. It was experienced as reality itself. For most of recorded history, across nearly every civilization, slavery wasn't treated as a moral catastrophe requiring justification. It was treated as an unremarkable fact of how society functioned, defended by philosophers, economists, and clergy who considered themselves reasonable, moral people. It took centuries of moral argument, economic upheaval, and enormous human suffering before that obvious reality was widely recognized as a profound wrong. For most of Western medical history, physicians confidently treated illness using the theory of the four bodily humors, a model with zero basis in observable anatomy, sustained for over 1,000 years not because the evidence supported it, but because it fit comfortably inside the explanatory framework available at the time. Patients were bled, sometimes fatally, by doctors entirely convinced they were practicing sound medicine. None of those eras experienced themselves as ignorant. Every one of them experienced itself exactly the way our own era experiences itself, as reasonable, as evidence-based, as simply seeing things as they are. Philosopher Thomas Kuhn described this pattern precisely. Scientific revolutions don't happen because individuals gradually update their beliefs. They happen because an entire framework of assumptions gets so strained by contradictions that it collapses all at once, replaced by a new framework that will, one day, feel just as obviously true, and just as invisible, to the people living inside it. Every era believes it has finally arrived at the truth. History remembers each one as a chapter. There's no reason to assume our century is the exception. Whatever assumptions you currently hold with total, unquestioned confidence about economics, medicine, the mind, about what's simply obvious, will very likely be viewed by future generations the way we view geocentrism, or bloodletting, or the moral defense of slavery, not as evil, exactly, as the visible limit of what your era's cage allowed you to see. 7. The invisible chains. If this has done its job so far, a question should be forming. Then why doesn't everyone just see this and step outside it? Here's the answer. And it's the whole point of everything so far. The strongest prison ever built has no walls, no bars, no visible architecture at all. It's built entirely from the inside. It's built from belief and not the beliefs you could list if someone asked, but the ones so deeply assumed they don't register as beliefs anymore. They register as reality. It's built from identity, because questioning a belief deeply enough is very often questioning who you are. And your mind will fight to protect your sense of self with a ferocity it rarely applies to protecting the truth. It's built from fear, of uncertainty, of social rejection, of losing the people who share your current reality, of discovering that a life already lived was organized around a mistaken premise. It's built from memory, the endlessly reconstructed story that tells you who you've always been, which makes real change feel less like growth and more like betraying your own history. It's built from desire, for comfort, for approval, for the specific rewards your particular loops were trained to chase. It's built from routine, the sheer gravitational pull of doing tomorrow what you did today, because the alternative requires the one resource most depleted in modern life, sustained, deliberate attention. And it's built from social expectation, the quiet, constant awareness of what the people around you expect you to remain, and the cost of no longer being it. None of these need walls. None of them need guards. A person raised with a certain reality will typically defend that reality more fiercely than any warden ever could, because somewhere along the way, that reality stopped feeling like something that they were given and started feeling like something they are. That's the final trick of the invisible prison. It doesn't just contain the prisoner. And if that sentence just made you uncomfortable, good. That's usually the moment people close the video. If you're still here, you're already doing the one thing most people never do. Subscribe now quietly and keep going. What comes next is the part most people never let themselves think about. It becomes the prisoner. There's a phenomenon observed in animals held in captivity long enough. When the door finally opens, many don't leave, not because the door is guarded, and not because the outside world is hostile, because the cage became the only environment their instincts know how to navigate. Freedom, to a mind shaped entirely by confinement, doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like the absence of the only structure that ever made the world predictable. Human beings aren't birds, but the pattern rhymes uncomfortably well. People who've spent decades organizing an entire identity around a marriage, a career, a belief system, or a grievance will frequently describe losing that structure, even a structure that visibly causes them pain, with the language of fear, not relief. That's why so many people stay in circumstances a detached observer would instantly recognize as limiting. The structure, however uncomfortable, is at least known. And to the predictive machinery of your brain, known suffering will often get chosen, again and again, over unknown possibility. Ask a man to leave his cell, and he may refuse. Ask him to leave himself, and refusal is almost guaranteed. 8. Can anyone actually escape? Let's be honest, because this isn't here to comfort you the way most content on this topic tries to. There's no simple technique, no 5-step method, no morning routine that dissolves a lifetime of conditioning. Anyone offering you that is selling something. But there is a beginning, and it's been described, in different language, by nearly every serious thinker who's examined this problem across the last 25 centuries. More than 2,000 years ago, Plato described prisoners chained since childhood inside a cave facing a wall, watching shadows cast by a fire behind them, shadows they'd come to accept as the entirety of reality, because they'd never known anything else. Plato's point wasn't that the prisoners were foolish. It was that the situation made any other conclusion nearly impossible. And crucially, he noted that a prisoner freed and dragged toward the light wouldn't feel enlightened at first. He'd feel pain, disorientation, and a strong urge to go back to the shadows, because the shadows were familiar. And to an unprepared mind, familiarity feels indistinguishable from truth. Socrates built an entire method around one deceptively modest starting point, admitting you don't know. His famous claim, that true wisdom begins with recognizing your own ignorance, wasn't humility for its own sake. It was a technical requirement. A mind convinced it already sees clearly has no reason to look again. Carl Jung, centuries later, described a process he called individuation, the lifelong project of integrating the parts of your psyche you've disowned or repressed, instead of continuing to project them, unexamined, onto other people. His insight was that much of what you insist is out there, in other people, in the world and circumstance, is frequently a disowned piece of yourself, encountered in disguise. Viktor Frankl, having survived the concentration camps of the Second World War, arrived at a related but distinct conclusion, that even under near total external control, one final freedom remains, the freedom to choose your internal response to circumstance. He didn't offer this as comfort. He offered it as an observation, made under the most extreme conditions imaginable, about where the boundary of the invisible prison actually sits. Erich Fromm, examining why so many people in free societies still behave as though unfree, argued that the burden of genuine autonomy is heavier than it looks, and that most people, faced with the discomfort of real freedom, will quietly choose various forms of escape instead: conformity, authoritarian submission, compulsive consumption, rather than carry the weight of authoring their own existence. Alan Watts, drawing on Buddhist philosophy, pointed at something stranger still, that the sharp boundary you feel between self and world might itself be a perceptual convention, not a fundamental truth, that the felt separation between observer and observed is one more wall in the architecture, built so early and so thoroughly that it gets mistaken for the shape of reality itself. Buddhist philosophy, older than most of the thinkers named here, offers a related diagnosis under a different name: attachment to outcomes, to identity, to the story of a fixed, permanent self, as the root of a great deal of unnecessary suffering, and sustained, honest attention, without immediate judgment, as the beginning of loosening that attachment's grip. And Nietzsche, characteristically unsentimental, argued that anyone who wants to become who they actually are has to first survive the destruction of who they currently believe themselves to be, a process he never romanticized, and never promised would be comfortable, or even survivable, for everyone who tried it. Notice what none of these thinkers offered you: a shortcut. What they offered, across 25 centuries, and completely different civilizations, was a strikingly consistent starting point: not certainty, but the willingness to doubt your own certainty; not the demolition of every belief, which is neither possible nor advisable, but the recognition that beliefs are structures, built at a particular time, for particular reasons, by a particular architect, and a structure someone else built can, with effort, be examined, renovated, or in some cases, dismantled entirely. This isn't the promise of a different, better reality waiting on the other side of the door. It might just be a truer one, and truer realities aren't always kinder. They're just, at minimum, more honestly yours. *9. Where this leaves you somewhere right now. A child is being handed a version of reality they didn't request and can't yet question: a language, a fear, a religion, a set of assumptions about what's normal, what's possible, what's simply true. In a few decades, that child will be an adult, defending those same assumptions with the same unexamined certainty every generation before them has defended theirs. Not because they're foolish, because that's exactly how the architecture was designed to function, and has functioned, without significant modification, for the entire span of recorded history. Somewhere else right now, someone is sitting in a room they've sat in 10,000 times before, the same walls, the same chair, the same tree outside losing its leaves in the same order, and for reasons they may never fully explain, they've paused. Not because a wall revealed itself. Walls, by their nature, rarely announce themselves, but because, for just a moment, something felt slightly less solid than it had the day before. We won't tell you what's on the other side of your particular door, because we don't know, and anyone who claims to know yours is describing their own. We'll only leave you with the question every thinker in this video, across every century, in every language, has ultimately been asking in one form or another. The same question this video opened with, even if you didn't recognize it then: if everything you currently call reality is a construction, assembled by people you didn't choose, at a time you can't remember, for reasons that were never explained to you, then what, exactly, are you calling yourself?